Today we're going to be working on numbers and operations with fractions. Specifically, we're going to be applying and extending our previous understanding of multiplication or a whole number by another fraction. So, our learning objective for today is by the end of this lesson, you should be able to multiply a whole number by a fraction. Before we get to this equation that I have written out right here, let's focus on understanding or revisiting multiplying one whole number by another whole number. So I have two equations written out right here, 32 times 4 and 25 times 5. When we multiply one whole number by another whole number, especially if it's a 2 or 3 digit number, we have to make sure that the place value are in the same place. So let's draw a line between the place values of these two numbers and make sure that the place values match up. So 3 and 4 are in the 1's place value, and the 3 and this blank is in the 10's place value. So when multiplying these numbers together, we would first multiply the 1's place value. So 4 times 2 is 8. And then we're going to multiply the 1's place value on the bottom with the 10's place value on the top, which would be 3 times 4 equals 12. So the answer for this equation is 128. So let's do the second problem as well. We're going to have 25 times 5. Let's make sure that the place values are in the same place. So we're going to draw a line between the place values. So the two 5's are in the 1's place value, and the 2 is in the 10's place value. So like this first equation, we're going to multiply the 1's place value first. So 5 times 5 equals 25. So we're going to put the 5 in the 1's place value, and we're going to carry the 2 over to the 10's place value. And we're going to multiply 5 times 2, which is 10, and then we're going to add the 2, which makes it 12. So this is multiplying whole numbers by another whole number. So now that we have recapped that, let's move on to multiplying a whole number by a fraction. So to make sure I have room, let's get rid of what I have here. Okay. Now, when multiplying a whole number by a fraction, in any equation, we know that we can use letters or symbols to represent another number in an equation. In this equation, I have my fraction, which I'm using A for my numerator, B for my denominator, and I'm using Q in place of my whole number. Okay? So my equation is my fraction A over B times Q to get my answer. Now, when you write your equation out, you can either multiply A times Q before you divide it by B to get your answer, or you can divide Q by B before you multiply it times A to get the same answer. So let's use real numbers in the equation now. So for this equation, I'm going to use 2/3 for my fraction. So 2/3 times 6 equals blank. So let's write the equation out, making sure that our numbers are in the same place in the equation as our letters or symbols. So A is your denominator. So it is 2 times our Q, which is our whole number of 6. So 2 times 6 divided by B, or in this equation is 3, equals blank. Now we're going to write this out because we're going to work it out. First, we're going to multiply 2 times 6, and then we're going to divide first. So in the second equation, we're going to divide 6 divided by 3 first before we multiply times 2. And we're going to see if we get the same product for both of these equations. So in the first equation, we're going to 2 times 6 first. So 2 times 6 equals 12. All right. Then we're going to multiply by 3. So 12 divided by 3 equals 4. Okay. So in this equation, multiplying first, our product was 4. Let's see if we get the same product if we divide first. So in this product, or this equation, we divide 6 divided by 3 equals 2. And then 2 times 2 equals 4. So in both of these equations, regardless if we multiplied first or divided first, we got the same product of 4. Now, this has been an example of multiplying a fraction by a whole number. Now, the equation will look different if we multiply a fraction by a fraction. So let's give an example of that. So first, we're going to make sure I have some room. So for our next equation, first we're going to write it out the same as this. We're going to use our letters or symbols first before we put any numbers to it. So it is when multiplying two fractions, so the first fraction is going to be A over B times C over D equals, so in this case, when we're using this equation to multiply fractions, your answer is going to be A times C, so we're going to write that as AC, or A times C, over B times D. We're going to write it like this. So this is your answer. So for your equation, A over B times C over D equals A times C over B times D. It's easier to understand when you're using real numbers. So let's give an example of using real numbers. So for this equation, we're going to do 2/3 times 4/5 equals blank. So, like in this equation on top, we multiply the two numerators to get the numerator of the answer. So in this case, 2 times 4 is 8 over 3 times 5, which is 15. When multiplying fractions, it is important to remember that you multiply straight across. So you always multiply your numerator times your numerator and your denominator times your denominator to get your answer. Otherwise, you would be cross-multiplying, which is if you multiply the numerator of one fraction times the denominator of another fraction, and you would get something completely different. But that's not what we're doing. That's not how you multiply one fraction times another fraction. Now, I have written out examples of using whole numbers to multiply times a fraction, or a fraction to multiply times a fraction. So for the we do portion, the students will now give me numbers to write out in equations, either as a whole number times a fraction, or as a fraction times a fraction, to work through multiple equations as a group to check for understanding, to make sure everybody is understanding the same issues and working at the same level. At the beginning of the lesson, for all of my lessons, the chat will be only for emergencies or when I stop to ask for understanding. In a normal lesson, I will paste the I do portion, and I will take regular breaks to make sure that I have time to ask questions to the students or give them an opportunity to ask me questions if something comes up that they don't understand. So that way I won't constantly have chats popping up, or I won't have two students talking and distracting while I'm trying to talk to them. For the resources for this, I would mostly just use the whiteboard for the I do and we do portion of the lesson. To check for the individual student information, I would provide a handout that I would make prior to the lesson, that they would either be emailed or it would be available on whatever online platform I'm using to teach, that would allow them to either print it out and fill it out and then resubmit it for me to check to figure out if they understand their multiplication, or if they have an issue with fractions, or if they have an issue with multiplying fractions times whole numbers, so that way I gauge where the student is academically. I will allow students to ask me questions for immediate feedback if there is an issue. So I will constantly be paying attention to the screen. So if I see a student that has their hand up and it's something that can't wait, I will allow them to ask me a question during the process or ask it in the chat. But other than that, it would mostly just be waiting until there is time for the feedback at the regular intervals.